She thought she was just hauling her own suitcase out of the airport, but inside was the future of a millionaire's empire. Would you open a stranger's bag if you realized it wasn't yours? Leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of Terminal B buzzed overhead as Jocelyn Dawson dragged her aching body through the maze of travelers. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished floor with each painful step, the sound mixing with her rolling wheels, crying babies, and departure announcements that seemed to echo directly into her skull. 3 days in Washington, D.C. with 32 eighth graders, she thought, massaging her temples. I deserve a medal. Or therapy. Probably both. The school trip had been a nightmare of lost permission slips, forgotten medications, and one particularly memorable incident involving Tommy Richardson, a cherry blossom tree, and what would forever be known as the Great B Incident of 2025. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from worried parents, late reports, and her principal demanding updates she was too exhausted to provide. All she wanted now was her mother's famous chicken soup, her threadbare pajamas, and approximately 14 hours of uninterrupted sleep. The pile of ungraded essays waiting on her kitchen table could wait another day or week. She was running on fumes and determination. The baggage carousel groaned, and Jocelyn found herself pressed against the metal barrier by a crowd of equally exhausted travelers. Designer handbags bumped against her worn canvas messenger bag. Expensive cologne mixed with the stale airport air, making her acutely aware of her rumpled cardigan and the coffee stain on her jeans. There, her black rolling suitcase appeared around the bend, looking as tired as she felt. Without thinking, she lunged forward, nearly elbowing a businessman in an Armani suit, and grabbed the handle. "Excuse me," the man muttered, shooting her a disapproving look. "Sorry," Jocelyn mumbled back, too tired to care about airport etiquette. She just wanted to get home. The suitcase felt heavier than usual as she maneuvered through the crowd, but she attributed it to her exhaustion. Her lower back screamed in protest as she lifted it into the taxi, and she made a mental note to start those yoga videos her sister kept recommending. "Where to, miss?" the cab driver asked, with his thick Brooklyn accent. She rattled off her address in Queens, then slumped against the cracked vinyl seat. The city lights blurred past the window as they crawled through evening traffic, and Jocelyn let her eyes drift closed. Something's different. The thought nagged at her as they pulled up to her modest apartment building. The suitcase definitely felt heavier, and when she tried to roll it over the sidewalk crack that always caught her wheels, it barely budged. "Since when did I pack bricks?" she muttered, struggling to drag the bag up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment. By the time she reached her door, she was panting and sweating despite the October chill. Her apartment welcomed her with familiar chaos, stacks of books on every surface, papers to grade scattered across the coffee table, and the lingering scent of the vanilla candle she'd forgotten to blow out before leaving. Home sweet messy home. But she was curiosity. She knew she'd packed light, just essentials for 3 days. So why did her suitcase feel like it contained a small anvil? Jocelyn kicked off her sneakers and unzipped the case on her living room floor, expecting to find her wrinkled clothes and toiletries. Instead, she found herself staring at a world she didn't recognize. Sleek silver devices she couldn't identify lay nestled in custom foam padding. Files with names like Empowerment Project and Acquisition were arranged in perfect order. A thick leather portfolio stamped with the logo Orson Enterprises dominated the center of the case, secured with a titanium lock. "What the hell?" she whispered, lifting one of the devices. It was surprisingly light, with a smooth surface that seemed to shimmer under her lamplight. She'd never seen anything like it. The leather portfolio was secured, but several loose documents had scattered when she'd opened the case. The papers were covered in technical diagrams, financial projections with numbers that made her head hurt, and legal language so dense she couldn't make sense of it. One phrase kept appearing: confidential, property of Orson Industries, unauthorized access, punishable by law. Jocelyn's hands shook as she gathered the papers. This wasn't her suitcase. This belonged to someone important, someone rich, someone who probably had lawyers on speed dial. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," she thought, panic rising in her chest. "I stole someone's luggage. I'm going to jail. I'm going to lose my job. Mom's gonna have to visit me in prison. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers, ready to call the airport, when her doorbell rang. The sound cut through her apartment. Jocelyn froze, staring at her front door. Nobody visited her unannounced. Her neighbors were strangers. Her friends texted before coming over, and her mother lived in New Jersey. The bell rang again, followed by sharp, impatient knocking. "Miss Dawson?" A deep male voice called through the door. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jocelyn's heart was beating so fast as she approached the door. The peephole revealed a man in an expensive-looking Italian suit, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. He stood with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors open for him immediately. She cracked the door open, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" "Luther Orson," he said, his voice authoritative. "And yes, you can help me by returning my property." Even through the narrow gap, she could see his eyes, steel gray and sharp. This was not a man accustomed to hearing no. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, acutely aware of the open suitcase behind her. His jaw tightened. "Miss Dawson, I tracked my luggage to this address. A simple mistake has turned into a very complicated problem. I need my case back. Now." The word "tracked" made her tremble. Of course, someone with a suitcase full of corporate secrets would have tracking devices. She probably looked like the world's most incompetent industrial spy. With trembling fingers, she undid the chain lock and opened the door fully. Luther Orson stepped into her apartment, and immediately her small space felt even smaller. He dominated the room not just with his height, he had to be at least 6'2", but with an aura of power that seemed to suck the air from the room. His gaze swept over her apartment, taking in the precarious stacks of books, the papers scattered across every surface, the mismatched furniture she'd collected from thrift stores and garage sales. When his eyes landed on the open suitcase, his entire body went rigid. "You opened it," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I thought it was mine," Jocelyn said quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. She was suddenly very aware that she was wearing her oldest jeans, a cardigan with a hole in the elbow, and no shoes. The cases look identical. It was an honest mistake. He moved toward the suitcase like a predator stalking prey, then knelt beside it with practiced efficiency. His hands moved over the contents, checking each item, his face growing darker with each passing second. "These documents," he said, holding up the scattered papers. "Did you read them?" "No, not really. I couldn't understand any of it." The lie felt hollow even to her. She had tried to read them, though the technical jargon might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Luther's eyes met hers, and she felt like a bug under a microscope. "Miss Dawson, do you have any idea what you've stumbled into?" "Look, mister. Orson, is it? I teach 8th grade English at a public school in Queens. I don't know anything about corporate espionage or whatever this is. I just grabbed the wrong bag at the airport." "Industrial espionage," he corrected coldly, beginning to pack the items back into the case with military precision. "And whether you intended to or not, you've compromised classified information worth billions of dollars, probably more than you'll make in your lifetime." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a slap. "Excuse me. These documents contain details of a merger that will reshape the tech industry. If this information becomes public before we're ready, wait just a minute." Jocelyn interrupted, her exhaustion and fear transforming into anger. "Not all of us have an empire to babysit, Mr. High and Mighty. Some of us just survive paycheck to paycheck, trying to make a difference in the world one student at a time." Luther looked up from his packing, surprise flickering across his features. Clearly, not many people interrupted him. "I don't care if your merger is worth $1 billion or $1 trillion, she continued, her voice rising. "I didn't ask for any of this. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I just spent 3 days keeping 32 teenagers from destroying our nation's capital. The last thing I need is some corporate shark acting like I'm a criminal because I made an innocent mistake." "Innocent?" Luther stood, towering over her. "You compromised." "I compromised nothing," Jocelyn shot back, rising on her toes to meet his glare. "I opened what I thought was my own suitcase in my own apartment. If you're so paranoid about your precious documents, maybe you should invest in better luggage tags instead of tracking devices." Silence followed. Luther stared at her as if she were an alien species he'd never encountered before. When was the last time someone had yelled at him? When was the last time anyone had challenged him at all? "You're right," he said finally, his voice quiet. Jocelyn blinked. "What?" "About the luggage tags. It was careless." He closed the suitcase with a decisive snap. "And I apologize for implying you were anything less than honest. This situation has me on edge." The apology was so unexpected that Jocelyn's anger deflated like a punctured balloon. "Oh, thank you." Luther picked up his case, then paused at her door. "Your suitcase is probably still at the airport. I can have it retrieved and delivered to you. That would be helpful." "Thank you." He nodded curtly and was gone, leaving Jocelyn staring at her closed door and wondering if the entire encounter had been a stress-induced hallucination. But 1 week later, as she sat in the back row of a contentious school board meeting, she realized Luther Orson was very, very real. Next on the agenda, the board president announced, "We have Mr. Luther Orson from the Orson Foundation here to discuss scholarship opportunities." Jocelyn's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, sending liquid pouring across her notes for her budget presentation. She watched in horror as the man from her apartment strode to the front of the room, looking every inch the powerful businessman in his navy suit and silk tie. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Luther's step faltered for just a moment. Recognition flashed between them, followed quickly by something that might have been amusement on his part and pure panic on hers. As he began his presentation about education funding and underprivileged youth, Jocelyn tried to sink lower in her plastic chair. Of all the school board meetings in all the boroughs and all of New York City, he had to walk into hers. When her turn came to present her desperate plea for classroom funding, Jocelyn's voice shook as she outlined the dire needs of her students. Books falling apart, outdated technology, not enough supplies to last the semester. She was passionate, articulate, and completely mortified that Luther was witnessing her school's poverty. After the meeting, as board members filed out discussing budget cuts and efficiency measures, Luther approached her. "Miss Dawson, Mr. Orson." She gathered her papers with shaking hands. "Small world." "Indeed." His expression was unreadable. "I listened to your presentation. Very compelling. But not compelling enough, apparently." The vote had been tabled. Political speak for thanks, but no thanks. Luther was quiet for a long moment, watching her. "I may have a proposition for you." Jocelyn's instincts screamed danger. "What kind of proposition?" "It seems some of my documents are still missing. Papers that weren't in my suitcase when you returned it." "That's impossible," she said shockingly. "I gave you everything. One folder is unaccounted for. Project files that are essential to my company's future." His gray eyes never left her face. "I believe they may have gotten mixed in with your belongings during the confusion." Jocelyn's mind raced back to that night. She'd been so panicked, so frantic to pack everything back properly. Had she missed something? Had papers fallen behind her couch? Under her coffee table? "I don't have anything of yours," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not knowingly," Luther agreed. "But if you help me search for these documents, I'll make sure your school gets the funding it needs. All of it. New books, updated technology, supplies for the entire year." Jocelyn stared at him. "You'd do that?" "I'd consider it an investment in education and in solving a mutual problem." She wanted to tell him no, to walk away from whatever dangerous game he was playing, but the faces of her students flashed through her mind. Kids who deserved so much more than what their underfunded school could provide. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Jocelyn extended her hand. "This is a terrible idea," she muttered as Luther's warm palm engulfed her smaller one. His lips curved in what might have been a smile. The best ones usually are. Jocelyn had never been inside a building where the elevator required a key card to access the top floors. She stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors, aware of how out of place she looked in her department store blazer and sensible flats. Luther stood beside her, radiating the kind of confidence that came from owning the building they were riding to the top of. He'd barely spoken during the car ride from her apartment, and Jocelyn had filled the silence by mentally cataloging all the ways this arrangement could go wrong. The elevator opened directly into the executive offices of Orson Industries, and Jocelyn gasped. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city sprawling endlessly in every direction. The office space was all clean lines and modern art, expensive furniture arranged like a museum display. "This way," Luther said, his hand briefly touching the small of her back to guide her forward. Heads turned as they walked through the office. Jocelyn caught whispers and curious glances from impeccably dressed employees. She tried to ignore the way her bargain blazer suddenly felt shabby and cheap. Luther's personal office was a monument to success. A massive desk made of what looked like a single piece of dark wood, leather chairs, and awards and photographs documenting a career of triumph. But it was the view that made her dizzy. They were so high up that the people on the street looked like ants. "Coffee?" Luther asked, moving to a sleek machine that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. "Just regular coffee would be fine," Jocelyn said, still staring out the window. "Do you ever get used to this view?" "You stop noticing after a while." Luther handed her a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven. "Shall we begin?" For the next 2 hours, they systematically went through every paper, every file, every document related to the missing folder. Luther explained the merger in terms simple enough for her to understand. His company was acquiring a smaller tech firm that had developed revolutionary software. The kind of software that would change how people interacted with technology forever. "And you're sure the missing documents aren't in your apartment?" Luther asked for the third time, his usually perfect composure showing signs of strain. "I've looked everywhere," Jocelyn insisted. "Under the couch, behind the bookshelf, even in my refrigerator, because sometimes I put things in weird places when I'm distracted. There's nothing there." Luther ran a hand through his dark hair, messing the perfect style for the first time since she'd met him. The gesture made him look younger, more human. "Without those documents, the merger could fall through," he said quietly. 3 years of work, gone. Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. "This is personal for you, isn't it? It's not just about the money." His jaw tightened. "Everything is about money in business, Miss Dawson." "Jocelyn," she corrected. "And I don't believe you." For a moment, she thought he might ignore her. Then he moved to the window, staring out at the city below. "My father built this company from nothing," he said finally. "Started with a single patent and a dream. When I was 12, he made a deal. Trusted the wrong people, got too confident. We lost everything overnight." Jocelyn set down her coffee cup, sensing this wasn't a story Luther told often. "We had to sell the house, move to a tiny apartment. My mother went back to work. My father took whatever jobs he could find. It took him 15 years to rebuild what he'd lost in one careless moment." Luther's reflection in the window looked haunted. "He made me promise never to take risks like that, never to trust anyone completely when business is involved." "But you're trusting me," Jocelyn pointed out softly. Luther turned from the window, his gray eyes meeting hers. "Against my better judgment, yes." The vulnerability in his admission hung between them. Jocelyn found herself noticing things she'd been too flustered to see before. The way his suit fit his tall frame perfectly. The intelligent intensity in his eyes. The strength in his hands as he gestured while talking. "You know," she said, breaking the tension, "for a billionaire, you make terrible coffee." Luther blinked, then threw back his head and laughed. A real laugh, rich and warm and completely unexpected. "Terrible coffee? It tastes like it was filtered through $100 bills," Jocelyn said, grinning. "All expensive and bitter." "I'll have to speak to my assistant about that," Luther said, his eyes dancing with amusement. "She picks the coffee. Let me guess. She has an MBA from Harvard and considers Starbucks a moral failing?" "Yale, actually. And she drinks something called ceremonial-grade matcha that costs $40 an ounce." Jocelyn nearly choked on her overpriced coffee. $40? For tea? For the powder that becomes tea, yes. Luther was still smiling, and the expression transformed his entire face. "I take it you're more of a diner coffee person?" $2 cup from the bodega on the corner, extra sugar, and they know my name. That's real coffee." She studied his face. When's the last time you had diner coffee? Luther paused, actually considering the question. I honestly can't remember. That's tragic. How do you function in New York without knowing the joy of bodega coffee? I have assistants who bring me things, Luther said, but his tone was self-deprecating rather than arrogant. Assistants who bring you $40 tea powder, Jocelyn pointed out. No wonder you're stressed about this merger. Your caffeine intake is all wrong. It was such a ridiculous observation that Luther laughed again, and Jocelyn felt a flutter of pride at drawing out this relaxed version of the intense businessman. They worked until late into the evening, going through files and documents, making lists of everywhere the missing folder might have ended up. Luther's assistants left one by one until they were alone in the quiet office, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows. I should go, Jocelyn said, glancing at her phone. It's almost 10 o'clock. I'll have my driver take you home, Luther said, already reaching for his phone. That's not necessary. It's the least I can do after keeping you here so late. Luther's tone brooked no argument, but his expression was gentler than it had been that first night in her apartment. As they waited for the elevator, Jocelyn found herself stealing glances at Luther's profile. In the soft lighting of the empty office, he looked less like an intimidating corporate shark and more like a man carrying too much weight on his shoulders. Luther, she said as the elevator doors opened, we'll find the missing documents. And even if we don't, you'll figure something out. You didn't get where you are by giving up easily. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. How can you be so certain? Because, Jocelyn said, stepping into the elevator. You've already survived losing everything once. You're stronger than you think. The elevator doors closed on Luther's surprised face, but not before Jocelyn caught a glimpse of something that might have been gratitude in his steel gray eyes. As the car Luther had sent drove her back to Queens, Jocelyn stared out at the city and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. More importantly, she wondered why the thought of seeing Luther again tomorrow made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The headline screamed from every news outlet in the city. Orson Industries merger leaked, and, quote, tech giant's billion-dollar deal exposed. Jocelyn stared at her phone screen in horror as she rode the subway to work, watching Luther's carefully planned acquisition crumble in real time. Her hands shook as she scrolled through article after article, each one containing details that sounded familiar from the documents she'd seen. Stock prices were plummeting, competitors were scrambling to make counteroffers, and legal experts were calling it one of the biggest corporate intelligence breaches in recent history. By the time she reached her classroom, her phone was buzzing with calls from the numbers. Reporters, she realized with growing panic. Somehow they'd connected her to the story. She let the calls go to voicemail, but that didn't stop the messages from piling up. Miss Dawson, this is Channel 7 News. We'd like to speak with you about your connection to Luther Orson. Sources suggest you may have had access to confidential documents. Oh, God, she thought, slumping into her desk chair. They think I'm the leak. Her students filed in for first period, chattering about their weekend plans, blissfully unaware that their teacher was at the center of a corporate scandal. Jocelyn tried to focus on her lesson plan, but her mind kept racing back to those missing documents. Had someone broken into her apartment, hacked her computer? How had the information gotten out? During her lunch break, she couldn't avoid Luther's calls any longer. Jocelyn. His voice was flat, emotionless. Luther, I saw the news. I'm so sorry. Are you? The anger in his tone made her freeze. What do you mean? My security team traced the leak back to you. That's impossible. Digital fingerprints don't lie, Jocelyn. The leaked documents were scanned from a device registered to your IP address. I don't even know what that means. Jocelyn's voice cracked. I didn't scan anything. I didn't leak anything. I wouldn't even know how. Really? Because my board of directors is asking some very pointed questions about why I involved a school teacher with no security clearance in sensitive corporate matters. They're wondering if I've lost my mind, trusting someone I barely know with information worth billions of dollars. Each word felt like a knife between her ribs. Luther, please. You know me. You know I wouldn't. Do I know you? Luther's laugh was bitter. 3 weeks ago, you were a complete stranger who'd accidentally stolen my luggage. Now you're the only person outside my company who had access to those documents. And coincidentally, they end up splashed across the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Did you sell me out for quick money? The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute judgment. Jocelyn felt something inside her chest crack and crumble. The man who had laughed at her terrible coffee jokes, who had trusted her with his father's story, who had looked at her like she mattered, that man was gone. In his place was the cold, suspicious billionaire who saw enemies everywhere. "You really believe I would do that to you?" she whispered. "I believe everyone has a price," Luther said. "I just miscalculated what yours was." The line went dead. Jocelyn stared at her phone, tears blurring her vision. Around her, the teacher's lounge buzzed with conversation, but she felt utterly alone. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? Her principal found her there an hour later, still staring at her silent phone. "Jocelyn, we need to talk." The conversation was brief and devastating. The school board was concerned about her involvement in the corporate scandal. Parents were asking questions. Until the matter was resolved, perhaps it would be best if she took some time off. Translation: "You're suspended pending investigation." Jocelyn cleared out her desk in a haze of disbelief. Her students, worried faces following her down the hallway. How could she explain that their teacher had been accused of corporate espionage? How could she explain it to herself? She went home to her empty apartment and cried until she had no tears left. Then she got angry. Luther Orson could believe whatever he wanted about her. He could let his paranoid corporate world poison what had been growing between them. But she wasn't going to let him destroy her life based on lies. For 3 days, she researched digital forensics, IP addresses, and corporate espionage. She called in favors from her tech-savvy brother-in-law and even reached out to a former student whose father worked in computer security. The truth, when she found it, was both simple and devastating. Luther's own cousin, Jericho Orson, had been feeding information to competitors for months. He'd used Jocelyn's brief access to the system as cover for his final, most damaging leak. Her IP address had been spoofed, her digital identity stolen and used as a shield for his betrayal. By the time she'd gathered enough evidence to prove her innocence, the damage was done. Luther's merger had collapsed, costing his company hundreds of millions of dollars. His reputation was in tatters, and according to the business news, several board members were calling for his resignation. Jocelyn sat in her apartment, staring at the folder full of evidence that would clear her name and expose the real traitor. She should feel vindicated. Instead, she just felt hollow. Luther had been so quick to believe the worst of her. The moment things went wrong, he'd abandoned any faith in her character and assumed she was just another person trying to use him. How could she have feelings for someone who thought so little of her? But even as she tried to nurse her anger, she couldn't forget the pain she'd heard in his voice during that terrible phone call. Luther wasn't just dealing with a business crisis. He was watching his father's legacy crumble because he'd trusted the wrong person. Again, the irony was crushing. In trying to protect himself from betrayal, he'd pushed away the one person who'd actually been loyal to him. Jocelyn looked at the evidence one more time, then made her decision. She would clear her name, not for Luther's sake, but for her own, and then she would walk away from his complicated, dangerous world and try to rebuild the quiet life he'd shattered. But first, she had a phone call to make. Luther stood outside PS 119 in Queens, feeling more nervous than he had before his first board presentation. The October morning was crisp, leaves crunching under his expensive Italian shoes as he watched children stream through the school's front doors, their backpacks bouncing and their voices creating a symphony of youthful energy. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. The folder in his hands contained everything, the evidence that proved Jocelyn's innocence, the confession his cousin had been forced to give when confronted with irrefutable proof of his betrayal, and a formal apology from Orson Industries, legal department that would clear her name completely. But Luther knew that wouldn't be enough. The damage he'd done with his accusations went deeper than legal documents could repair. He'd shattered something precious and fragile that had been growing between them, something he hadn't even realized he valued until it was gone. The stack of rare books balanced in his other arm felt heavier than his guilt. First edition classic novels that belonged in his personal library, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, The Great Gatsby, all books Jocelyn had mentioned loving during their late-night conversations in his office. He'd rehearsed his apology a dozen times, but every version sounded inadequate. Finally, Luther forced himself through the front doors. The school was nothing like the private academies of his youth. The hallways were bright with student artwork, but worn from decades of use. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of industrial floor cleaner mixed with the lingering scent of cafeteria pizza. He found Jocelyn's classroom by following the sound of her voice, warm, patient, animated, as she read to a small group of students gathered on a colorful carpet. Through the open door, he could see her sitting cross-legged, a picture book in her hands, completely absorbed in bringing the story to life for her audience. The children were captivated, their faces turned up to hers like flowers following the sun. One little girl leaned against Jocelyn's shoulder, her thumb in her mouth, while a boy with thick glasses hung on every word. Luther felt his chest tighten. This was who Jocelyn truly was, not the woman who'd accidentally stumbled into his corporate world, but a teacher who shaped young minds with infinite patience and genuine love. Watching her, he understood why she'd been so passionate in her budget presentation, why she'd fought so hard for funding. These children adored her, and she would do anything to give them what they needed. How had he convinced himself, even for a moment, that someone like this could be capable of betrayal? When the story ended and the children returned to their desks for independent reading time, Luther knocked softly on the doorframe. Jocelyn looked up, and her expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "Mr. Orson, may I come in?" She glanced at her students, who were now openly staring at the tall man in the expensive suit. "Class, this is a visitor. Please continue with your reading while I step into the hallway." In the corridor, with the classroom door partially closed, Luther felt the full weight of Jocelyn's defensive posture. Her arms were crossed, her chin raised, but he could see the hurt she was trying to hide behind her professional composure. "I know who the real leak was," he said without preamble. "My cousin Jericho. He's been selling information to competitors for months, and he used your brief access to our system as cover for his final betrayal." Jocelyn's expression didn't change. "I know. I figured that out 3 days ago." Luther blinked. "You... what?" "I'm not stupid, Luther. And I'm not helpless. When you accused me of corporate espionage, I did my own investigation." Her voice was quiet but steel-edged. "I know about Jericho's gambling debts, his girlfriend who works for your biggest competitor, and the offshore accounts where he's been hiding his payments. Why didn't you call me? Why would I? You made it very clear what you thought of me. The moment things went wrong, you assumed I was just another person trying to use you. You didn't even give me the chance to defend myself." Luther closed his eyes, the truth of her words hitting him. "You're right. I was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. Yes, you were. Jericho played on my fears, fed me false evidence, made me doubt everything I thought I knew about you. But that's not an excuse." Luther opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. "I should have trusted what I felt here." He pressed his hand to his chest, instead of what the data seemed to show. "I should have known that someone who cares as much as you do could never be capable of such betrayal." Jocelyn's arms uncrossed slightly. "Someone who cares as much as I do? About your students. About doing the right thing. About—" Luther swallowed hard. "About me, I hoped." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway was quiet, except for the distant sounds of children learning and playing. "I brought you something," Luther said, offering her the stack of books. "I know they can't undo the damage I caused, but I thought your students might enjoy them." Jocelyn's eyes widened as she recognized the titles. "Luther, these are first editions. They're worth nothing compared to what I destroyed with my accusations." Luther's voice was rough. "I cost you your job, your reputation, your peace of mind. I know you probably never want to see me again, but I needed you to know how sorry I am." Jocelyn ran her fingers over the leather binding of Pride and Prejudice, her favorite novel. The gesture was unconscious, reverent, and it made Luther's heart ache with hope and regret in equal measure. "My job is fine," she said quietly. "The school board reinstated me once the real story came out. But you're right about the rest of it." "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," Luther said. "Publicly clear your name, make donations to the school, anything. I don't want your money." Jocelyn looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never wanted your money, Luther. I just wanted—" "What?" he asked softly. "What did you want?" "I wanted you to see me, really see me, not as a threat to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as someone who—" She shook her head, apparently unable to finish the thought. "As someone who—" "What?" "As someone who is falling in love with you," she whispered. The admission hung between them, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Luther stepped closer, his voice dropping to match hers. "Jocelyn, Miss Dawson?" A small voice interrupted from the classroom doorway. Tommy threw up on his desk. Jocelyn immediately shifted into teacher mode, all traces of vulnerability disappearing. "I'll be right there. Mr. Orson, I need to—" "Of course. I'll wait. For the next hour." Luther watched Jocelyn handle the crisis with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to chaos. She cleaned up the mess, comforted the sick child, called his parents, sanitized surfaces, and kept the rest of her students engaged and happy despite the disruption. She was magnificent. When her lunch break finally arrived, Jocelyn found Luther sitting in the tiny teacher's lounge, looking completely out of place among the mismatched furniture and motivational posters. "You're still here," she said. "I told you I'd wait." Luther stood. "Can we talk? Privately?" They walked to a small courtyard behind the school, a patch of grass and benches where teachers sometimes ate lunch when the weather was nice. The October air was crisp, and Jocelyn pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. "I need to explain something," Luther said as they sat on one of the weathered benches. "About why I reacted the way I did?" "You don't owe me any explanations." "Yes, I do." Luther turned to face her fully. "When I was 15, my father started rebuilding our company. He was paranoid about security, about trust, about making the same mistakes that had cost us everything. He taught me that in business, everyone has an agenda, everyone can be bought, everyone will eventually disappoint you if the stakes are high enough." Jocelyn listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. "For 20 years, I've lived by those rules. I've never let anyone get close enough to hurt me the way my father was hurt. I built walls around myself, around my company, around my heart." Luther's voice grew quieter. "And then you stumbled into my life with your terrible coffee opinions and your fierce love for your students, and you made me want to tear those walls down." "Luther, when the leak happened, when all the evidence pointed to you, it wasn't just my business that was threatened. It was the first time I'd opened myself up to someone, and it terrified me. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I retreated behind those walls and treated you like a threat instead of—" He swallowed hard. "Instead of the woman I was falling in love with." The words settled between them, honest and utterly vulnerable. "You were falling in love with me?" Jocelyn asked softly. "I was. I am." Luther reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "Those weeks we spent working together, talking until late at night, watching you light up when you talked about your students. I'd never felt anything like that before. You made me want to be better than I am." Jocelyn's fingers tightened around his. "You don't need to be better, Luther. You just need to trust. In me, in yourself, in the possibility that not everyone in your life is going to betray you." "Can you forgive me?" Luther asked. "Not for the business accusations. I know those documents will clear your name, but for not trusting what we had, for letting fear make me cruel to the one person who'd never hurt me." Jocelyn studied his face for a long moment, and Luther felt his entire future hanging in the balance. Then, slowly, she smiled. "I can forgive you," she said, "but I need you to promise me something. Anything. The next time someone tries to convince you that I'm not who you think I am, I need you to remember this conversation. Remember how you feel right now, looking at me. Can you do that?" "Yes," Luther said without hesitation. "I promise." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching leaves fall from the maple tree above them. "So what happens now?" Jocelyn asked. "Now I spend every day proving that you made the right choice in forgiving me," Luther said. "Starting with making sure your school gets that funding I promised." "Luther, you don't have to. I want to. Not because I owe you, but because watching you fight for these kids showed me something I'd forgotten about why business should matter. It's not about the money or the power. It's about making the world better for people who deserve better." Jocelyn leaned against his shoulder, and Luther felt something tight in his chest finally relax. "There's something else," he said. "The merger may be dead, but I'm working on something new. An education technology initiative that could revolutionize how underfunded schools access resources. I could use a partner who understands what teachers and students actually need." "A partner?" Luther turned so he could see her face. "In business and in life, if you'll have me." Before Jocelyn could answer, the school bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period. "I have to get back to my class," she said, standing. Luther stood with her, catching her hand before she could walk away. "Jocelyn, I know I have a lot to make up for. I know trust has to be rebuilt slowly. But I need you to know, I'm not going anywhere. This isn't some corporate project with a deadline. This is the rest of my life we're talking about." Jocelyn rose up on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Then you'd better get used to bodega coffee, because I'm not changing my standards just because you're rich." Luther's answering laugh followed her all the way back to her classroom, where 32 eighth graders were waiting to ask their teacher why the man in the fancy suit had made her smile like that. 6 months later, Luther stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, looking out at a sea of investors, journalists, and industry leaders who'd gathered for what they believed would be the announcement of Orson Industries' next major acquisition. The merger that had originally brought him and Jocelyn together was ancient history now, a cautionary tale about corporate espionage that had actually strengthened his company's security protocols. Jericho was serving time for industrial espionage, and the board had unanimously approved Luther's new strategic direction. But as he looked out at the expectant faces in the audience, Luther felt the familiar weight of his father's expectations. The pressure to always choose profit over principle, growth over personal happiness. In the front row, Jocelyn sat with her hands clasped in her lap, wearing the navy dress he'd bought her for their first official date. She'd protested the expense, of course, but she'd worn it because she knew it mattered to him. Even now, she was making small sacrifices to fit into his world, just as he was about to make the biggest sacrifice of his life to stay in it. The past 6 months had been the happiest of Luther's life. He and Jocelyn had grown closer despite the challenges of merging their very different worlds. She'd taught him the joy of Sunday morning farmers markets and hole-in-the-wall restaurants, where the food was incredible and the atmosphere was loud and chaotic and perfect. He'd shown her the quiet luxury of Broadway shows, weekend trips to his house in the Hamptons, and what it felt like to never worry about money. But it was the quiet moments that had sealed his fate. Jocelyn grading papers at his dining table while he worked on presentations, her red pen moving across student essays with patient precision. Late-night conversations where she helped him see business decisions through the lens of human impact rather than pure profit. The way she'd curl up against him while they watched movies, unconsciously trusting him. He'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with her, which made what he was about to announce even more devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Luther began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. 6 months ago, Orson Industries faced a crisis that could have destroyed everything my father built. Instead, it taught me something valuable about the difference between success and significance, the audience murmured, clearly not expecting a philosophical turn from the notoriously pragmatic CEO. "Today, I'm announcing a new direction for our company. Instead of acquiring another tech firm, we're launching the Orson Education Initiative, a comprehensive program to provide technology, resources, and funding to underfunded schools across the country." Surprised applause rippled through the room, but Luther could see the confusion on investors' faces. This wasn't the profit-driven announcement they'd expected. This initiative represents a $50 million commitment over the next 5 years, with a focus on reaching students who have been overlooked by traditional educational funding models. The applause grew stronger, But Luther caught sight of several board members exchanging worried glances. $50 million was significant, even for a company Orson's size. However, Luther continued, and the room fell silent. This expansion requires my personal oversight and will necessitate extensive travel. Therefore, effective immediately, I'll be relocating to our London office to oversee our European operations. It was silent for a while. Luther's eyes found Jocelyn in the front row, watching her face go pale with shock. This was the first time he'd mentioned London, the first indication that their relationship might have an expiration date. He'd agonized over this decision for weeks. The London position was real. His board had been pressuring him to take it for months, seeing it as the next logical step in his career. It would position him as the heir apparent to the company's international operations, virtually guaranteeing him the CEO position when his current CEO stepped down in 3 years. It was everything his father had worked toward, everything Luther had been groomed for since childhood, the culmination of 20 years of careful planning and positioning. It was also 3,000 miles away from the woman he loved, but Luther had convinced himself it was the right choice. Jocelyn had her life in New York, her students, her apartment, her sister, and her mother in New Jersey. Her world was small and rooted and perfect exactly as it was. How could he ask her to give that up for his ambitions? Better to make a clean break now, before they got in too deep. Better to let her find someone who could give her the stability and presence she deserved. The transition will begin next month, Luther concluded, his voice steady despite the way his heart was breaking. Thank you for your continued support of Orson Industries. The applause was polite but subdued as Luther left the podium. He'd given them good news about the education initiative but confused them with the London announcement. Stock prices would probably dip until analysts figured out what his move meant for the company's future. Luther didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was the look of betrayal on Jocelyn's face as she slipped out of the ballroom before he could reach her. He found her 20 minutes later in Central Park, sitting on their bench, the same one where they'd had their first real conversation after their reconciliation. She was staring at the pond, her face composed but her hands shaking slightly. "You're leaving," she said without looking at him as he sat down beside her. "The board thinks it's the right move strategically. Cut the corporate speak, Luther." Jocelyn finally turned to face him, and he saw the tears she was trying to hold back. "You're leaving. You made this decision without talking to me, without even telling me you were considering it." "Jocelyn, this is an incredible opportunity. For you, maybe. What about us? What about everything we've built together over the past 6 months?" Luther felt like he was drowning. "You have your life here. Your students need you. Your family is here. I can't ask you to give that up to follow me across the ocean. Did you ever consider asking?" Jocelyn's voice was quiet but steady. "Did you ever think maybe I'd want to make that choice for myself?" Luther faltered. The truth was, he'd been so afraid of her saying no that he'd never given her the chance to say yes. "You did it again," Jocelyn said, standing up from the bench. "You made a unilateral decision about our relationship based on what you think is best for me, without actually consulting me, just like you did when you accused me of corporate espionage. That's not the same thing, isn't it?" Jocelyn's composure finally cracked. "You're still so afraid of being hurt that you push people away before they can leave you. You're ending our relationship to protect yourself from the possibility that I might not want to follow you to London." Luther stood as well, reaching for her hands. "I'm trying to do what's right. What's right is trusting me enough to be honest about what you want." Jocelyn pulled away from him. "What's right is having enough faith in what we have to fight for it instead of running away the moment things get complicated." "I'm not running away. This is my career, my family's legacy. And what am I, Luther? What are we?" Jocelyn's voice broke. "Am I just a pleasant distraction until your real life calls? Someone you can compartmentalize and leave behind when it's convenient? You know that's not true." "Do I?" Jocelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because right now, it feels like I'm watching you choose everything else over me. Again." Luther watched her walk away. every instinct screaming at him to follow her, to tell her the truth, that leaving her was the hardest thing he'd ever done, that London meant nothing if she wasn't there, that he'd been a coward who'd rather break his own heart than risk having her break it for him. But he let her go. Because maybe she was right. Maybe he was too damaged, too afraid, too selfish to deserve someone like her. 3 days later, Luther was in his office packing files for the London transition when his assistant buzzed him. "Mr. Orson? There's a Ms. Dawson here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." Luther's heart jumped. Send her in. But it wasn't Jocelyn who walked through his door. It was an older woman with the same warm eyes and stubborn chin, carrying a thermos in a manila envelope. "Mrs. Dawson," Luther said, standing. "Jocelyn's mother. Eleanor," she corrected, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. "And you're the fool who's about to throw away the best thing that ever happened to him," Luther blinked. "I'm sorry. Jocelyn told me about London, about how you made this big decision without talking to her, then had the nerve to act like you were protecting her." Eleanor opened her thermos and poured coffee into the cap, offering it to Luther. "Drink that. It's real coffee, not that overpriced swill you probably have here." Luther accepted the cup automatically, too stunned by this turn of events to do anything else. The coffee was strong and bitter and perfect, exactly like Jocelyn had described. "Mrs. Eleanor, I don't understand why you're here." "Because my daughter is upstairs in her apartment crying over a man who's too scared to admit he loves her." Eleanor's voice was gentle but implacable. "And because sometimes stubborn people need someone to knock sense into them." She slid the manila envelope across his desk. "Open it." Inside were documents. Job applications, resumes, letters of recommendation, all for teaching positions in London. "She's been researching international schools for the past 3 days, Eleanor said quietly. "Ever since your press conference. She hasn't said a word to you about it because she's terrified you'll think she's trying to manipulate you into staying. But Luther, that girl would follow you to the moon if you asked her to." Luther's hands shook as he flipped through the applications. Jocelyn had been willing to leave everything, her job, her family, her entire life, to be with him, and he'd been so convinced she wouldn't that he'd never given her the chance. "Why didn't she tell me?" he whispered. "Because she loves you enough to want you to choose her, not just let her follow you." Eleanor leaned forward. "She needs to know that you want her in London, not that you're willing to tolerate her presence there." Luther looked up from the papers. "I've made a terrible mistake." "Yes, you have. But it's not too late to fix it." Eleanor stood, gathering her things. "The question is, what are you willing to do to get her back?" Luther was already reaching for his phone. "Whatever it takes," Eleanor smiled. The same warm, transformative smile her daughter had inherited. "Then you'd better hurry. Her plane leaves in 2 hours." "Her plane?" "To London. She got an interview at the American International School, figured if you weren't going to fight for your relationship, she'd have to do it herself." Luther was already grabbing his jacket. "Eleanor, Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you've convinced my daughter you're worth the risk she's taking on you." The ride to JFK Airport was the longest 45 minutes of Luther's life. Traffic crawled, his driver took every red light personally, and Luther's phone calls to Jocelyn went straight to voicemail. He ran through the terminal like a man possessed, his expensive suit drawing stares as he dodged travelers and luggage carts. The departure board showed her flight boarding at gate 23, and Luther pushed through the crowds with single-minded determination. He found her at the gate, sitting alone with her familiar canvas bag at her feet and a book open in her lap. She looked small and brave and utterly beautiful, and Luther felt his heart crack open at the sight of her. "Jocelyn," she looked up, surprise and hurt warring in her expression. "Luther, what are you doing here?" "Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life," he said, dropping into the seat beside her. "Excuse me? You shouldn't have to follow me to London." Luther took her hands, holding tight when she tried to pull away. "I should be begging you to let me stay here." "Luther, I don't understand." "I called the board an hour ago. I'm turning down the London position." Luther's words tumbled out in a rush. I'm staying in New York, staying with the Education Initiative, staying where I belong, which is wherever you are. Jocelyn stared at him. You turned down London? But that's your career, your future. You're my future, Luther said simply. The merger, the London position, the family legacy. None of it means anything if I don't have you to share it with. I've spent so many years building a life that looked successful from the outside that I forgot what actually matters. Your father's dreams were his dreams, not mine. Luther brought her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. My dream is coming home to you every night. My dream is building something meaningful together, helping kids who need advocates, making the world a little bit better because we're in it together. Tears were streaming down Jocelyn's face. Luther, I love you, he said, the words coming easily now that he'd stopped fighting them. I love your terrible taste in coffee and your fierce loyalty to your students. I love the way you make me want to be better than I am. I love that you're brave enough to follow me across the ocean, but I love you too much to let you give up your life for mine. You love me, Jocelyn repeated as if testing the words. Desperately, completely, forever, if you'll let me. Luther reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Which brings me to the real reason I'm here. Jocelyn's eyes widened as Luther dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the busy airport gate. Jocelyn Dawson, he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the surrounding chaos. You've turned my entire world upside down in the best possible way. You've shown me what love looks like when it's not based on fear or conditions or corporate strategy. You've made me want to tear down every wall I built to protect myself, because a life without you isn't worth protecting. Other passengers were stopping to watch now, phones appearing to capture the moment, but Luther only had eyes for her. Will you marry me? He asked, opening the box to reveal a simple, perfect solitaire diamond. Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worth the risk you're taking on me? For a moment that felt like eternity, Jocelyn just stared at him. Then she laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Luther's heart soar. Yes, she said, sliding off her chair to kneel with him on the airport floor. Yes, but only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me that the next time you have to make a big decision about our future, you'll remember that we're a team now. No more protecting me from choices I should get to make myself. I promise, Luther said solemnly, sliding the ring onto her finger. Partners in everything. Partners in everything, Jocelyn agreed. And then she was kissing him as the entire gate erupted in applause. I can't believe you're making me do this again, Jocelyn said, staring at the black rolling suitcase with deep suspicion. Luther laughed, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they stood in their bedroom. Formerly his bedroom, now transformed with her books and warmth and the controlled chaos that seemed to follow her everywhere. It's our honeymoon, he pointed out, and I triple-checked the luggage tags. That's what you said last time. Last time, we weren't married. Last time, I wasn't completely yours. Luther pressed a kiss to the spot where her neck met her shoulder, making her shiver. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Jocelyn turned in his arms, smiling up at the man who'd become her husband 6 hours earlier in a ceremony that had somehow perfectly blended his world and hers. Elegant but warm, expensive but intimate, with her students as junior bridesmaids and as board members awkwardly attempting the electric slide. Promise me that this time we double-check the luggage tags, she said, echoing the end of her own story. Luther kissed her forehead, his gray eyes soft with love and amusement. Only if you promise not to steal my empire again. Again? I never stole it the first time, didn't you? Luther's smile was tender and knowing. You stole my heart, my future, my entire reason for being. I'd say that's a pretty successful heist. Jocelyn stood on her toes to kiss him properly. I love you, Luther Orson. I love you too, Mrs. Orson. Now and forever. As they finished packing for their honeymoon in Italy, Luther couldn't help but smile at the irony. A year ago, he would have said that love was the most dangerous risk a successful person could take. Now he knew the truth. The only real risk was living without it. As for Jocelyn, She'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful destinations were the ones you never planned to visit. Sometimes the wrong suitcase led you to exactly the right life. Sometimes the best love stories began with the most impossible mix-ups.